How many of you have been teachers?
Teachers.
How many of you have been social workers? How many of you have been parents? If you've been any of these, you've grappled with the question I put in today's sermon. But chances are you haven't confronted it at the grand abstract level at which I've stated it. Let's get more specific or concrete. When Ricky on the third row has snapped the bra strap of the girl in front of him for the 6th time, or thrown the spit wad at Jimmy for the 8th time. When George has come to school stoned for the 3rd time this week. When Willie and Alan have gotten in a fight on the playground. When Alice and Samantha are calling each other names. When Tommy is sleeping in the woods because he's afraid to encounter his alcoholic mother. The practical question that eats at the people who are trying to help, that bugs them during the day and haunts them in the wee hours of the night is bad behavior innate somehow, or is it learned? And can it be unlearned? Or more concretely, what can I do to help this kid out of these destructive patterns to have some kind of chance in life? When I think of good and evil, the specific case that comes to my mind is John Arnold, the convicted murderer I represented on South Carolina's death row for 14 years and walked with to his execution in 1998. John had escaped from a prison in Pennsylvania, hitchhiked to South Carolina with a young girl, linked up with his cousin and the cousin's girlfriend, and one day when they were high on drugs, they picked up an African-American female farm worker, hitchhiking to work, and took her to a secluded area, and after forcing her to perform sexual acts, killed her in a brutal manner. If the word evil has any meaning, the act they committed was certainly an evil one, exhibiting a callous disregard for the dignity and well-being of a human. However, in representing John, I was guided by my own moral belief that the state was attempting to perpetrate an evil in executing him. I was not called on to excuse or justify John's actions. I was called on to attempt to prevent an evil outcome, and I was comfortable doing so. But in the course of the representation, I did my best to come up with an explanation of what factors in John's past had led him to his crime. John had a port wine birthmark that covered most of his face, and his lawyers suspected that he had fetal alcohol syndrome, but our client would never cooperate with the test to see if this were true because he didn't want to besmirch the honor of his late mother. His antisocial behavior started at about age 10, and from the age of 12 until his brief escape and the murder at age 21, he had spent all but about 3 months of his life behind bars for one thing or another. And so my own specific version of the question put in the sermon title is, was John fated to commit this heinous act? Was there some intervention that might have averted it if the right person had gotten to him soon enough? Or was this violent behavior ingrained in his personality? Let's step back and look at our words here. For purposes of what follows, I take evil to mean bad things that happen caused by human action which is intended to cause harm, or which a reasonable person would expect to cause harm. In other words, the way I'm using it here, bad luck is not evil, nor are earthquakes, hurricanes, cancer, or most car wrecks. And I exclude animals from my definition of evil. One of you posted online recently a photo of the shards of your goldfish bowl after a raccoon had come into the patio and had your pet for a late night snack. No, I'm not going to call that raccoon evil. The raccoon was doing what raccoons do. What do I mean by natural? There's a real problem with definition here. The word nature has 9 definitions in Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, and the word natural has 15. Surprisingly, none of these 24 definitions get at what I want to call the raccoon I just mentioned. He belongs to the realm of wild things, of nature, which consists of that part of the world not created by human invention. Natural as opposed to civilized, or as opposed to man-made. When I say the raccoon is not evil, I'm saying that the category evil does not apply to beings such as raccoons, and more broadly, that nature in this sense is beyond good and evil. Good and evil are important moral concepts in human life. But there's a vast realm in which they're simply irrelevant. The realm of raccoons and snakes and stars and galaxies, of oceans and deserts and vast distances in space uninhabited by humans. We call this realm nature. And one of the most important ways we encounter nature is the enterprise we call science. Science is a human way of knowing, but if nature is beyond good and evil, so is science. Having made this tidy distinction, I'm now going to muddle it. For the thing we're really interested in for exploring the question of whether evil is natural is not nature outside of humans, but what is called human nature. Not what's out there, but what's in here. This is using the word nature in a different sense, to mean the essence of something. And in asking the question whether evil is natural, we're asking whether humans, in their essence, are evil. We're not writing on a blank slate here, for whether or not we consider ourselves Christians, we live in Western culture and are influenced by the Christian idea of original sin, something that goes back to about the earliest Christian writing we have, St. Paul's interpretation of the Garden of Eden story in Genesis. In that story, God's punishment on Adam for eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that humans shall die. Paul says, sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. That's in Romans. Paul sees Christ as the new Adam, reversing the sentence of the original one, quote, for as all die in Adam, so all will be made alive in Christ. That's from Corinthians. Well, all have sinned. It's hard to argue with that. Each of us at some point will transgress some moral code. No matter how strict or lenient, each of us will at some point fail to live up to the standards imposed on us or those we have set for ourselves, particularly if you include thoughts as well as actions in the definition of sin. Some of you may be sitting at this very moment thinking of violent acts you'd like to commit against the minister if he doesn't hurry up and get on to something interesting. But Paul does not go so far as the Calvinist ministers of old New England, who held that we are all nothing but sin, that we all deserve eternal punishment, and that it's only the arbitrary grace of God that saves some of us. I remember reading Jonathan Edwards' classic sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in high school, and being fascinated and repulsed by it. In preparing for this sermon, I have gone so far as to dip into a treatise that Edwards wrote in 1758, defending the doctrine of original sin. He takes on a liberal of the time, a Dr. Turnbull, who had argued, as I would argue, that generally people are good and obey the laws and commandments, but that what we notice are the exceptions, the times when people break out and commit heinous acts. You don't see a newspaper headline every morning saying, most people stayed home, watched television, went to bed, kissed their wives. You don't see that kind of newsletter paper headline. To this, Edwards responds, in effect, it is not a matter of decree, that as long as each of us commits one sin, we are subject to eternal ruin. Well, it is no small wonder that there were those in New England in the 18th century who felt that this was entirely too gloomy an assessment. And some of these became Unitarians, and some of these became Universalists. Not only did they reject the idea that all were inherently depraved because of the little game with the apple back there in the garden, most of our religious ancestors rejected the notion of an angry God. If God created humans, why is he or she going to be angry at them? Is she angry at the raccoon for eating the goldfish? The homeowner may be. If God is loving, what pleasure could he or she take in eternal torment of humans? This is the central question of universalism. For that matter, if the humans had to endure eternal torment for their sins, why not the raccoons as well? But let's get back to the question we posed, whether evil is natural. Calvinism asserts that it is, in the sense that sin is inherent in human nature, and even a little of it is enough to evoke eternal punishment. Now, to be fair to Edwards, he goes on to assert that the punishment can be evaded by God's saving grace in Jesus for those who accept Jesus. So we have the Calvinist take and the liberal reaction. What does science have to say? The object of science is a description of nature. And this is a question of human nature, which, as I've already said, is a different definition of nature than the rest of nature. Are humans inherently evil, depraved in their nature, their essence? Well, first off, science doesn't use words like depraved, evil and sin, God, devil, soul, damnation, and salvation. Science tries to stick with propositions that are provable or falsifiable by evidence. Science deals with objective reality, and the results of its experiments should not depend on who the experimenter is, what the experimenter's belief system is, or generally where the test is conducted. Though science doesn't deal with evil, it can deal with those things which we usually put under that category: murder, violence, harm on a large or small scale, when people are likely to act morally and when not, mental illness, anger, and its triggers. One very useful scientific piece which came out recently is a book by the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker called Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. I preached on this a year and a half ago and summarized the book this way. In this book, Pinker tackles the question of whether the modern age is really more violent than previous times in human history and prehistory, and concludes that it is not. With great flair, he marshals the known studies done by other scholars to make a compelling case that whether we're talking about war or just murder, the present age is less violent than all the ages which preceded it, and by a huge factor. Now, I set out the question of whether evil is inherent today in theological terms, the Calvinists versus the religious liberals of the 18th century. But at about the same time, a parallel debate was going on among secular thinkers. And it is in this context that Pinker sets his argument, the centuries-old debate about the nature of humans and the nature of society. On the one hand, we have Thomas Hobbes, who held that if we stripped away civilization, we would be reduced to a war of all against all, and concluded that life in the state of nature was, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. Hobbes said that the rise of the state, which he called Leviathan, civilizes people and pacifies them because the state acquires a monopoly on violence. The opposite view is represented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a romantic and put forward the notion of the noble savage. If we strip away the veneer of civilization, we will see people who have natural self-restraint, are at peace with each other and with their environment. Rousseau's idea of the noble savage originated with the indigenous peoples encountered by the expanding European colonial powers of the 18th century, and it influenced the French Revolution and is still an important part of our thinking today. We tend to romanticize Native Americans, for example, and to assume that they were all living in the peaceable kingdom until the Europeans arrived. A great example of the noble savage myth is the movie Avatar, where a peaceable, innocent race of blue extraterrestrial hippies is brought down by militaristic humans working for an evil corporation. Pinker comes down squarely on the side of Hobbes in this debate, Hobbes versus Rousseau. Whether we consider violence and warfare or single acts of homicide, people in state societies are much less violent than people in non-state societies. And as the state has grown stronger, its power to suppress violence has increased. The path to peace, in other words, is through Leviathan. Those of us who support big government politically may be cheered by this. Pinker amasses an impressive amount of data to back up his claims. He looks at prehistoric archaeological sites of hunter-gatherer peoples, where rates of violent death are estimated by the number of burials with injuries. He looks at the anthropological data on modern hunter-gatherers, modern horticulturalists, and other tribal groups, and then at state societies. All of the non-state societies had a higher rate of death from violence than any of the state societies. The most violent of the non-state societies was the Crow Creek of South Dakota, an archaeological site dating to 1325 of the Common Era, which had an estimated 60% killed in warfare. The average of all the prehistoric sites was 15%. The average for contemporary or recent hunter-gatherers was about 14%. Then come the contemporary tribal societies that engage in some mixture of hunting and horticulture, most from New Guinea or the Amazon rainforest, and one European example, and the average rate of violent death for this group is 24.5%. Then he considers state societies. The oldest in the sample in pre-Columbian Mexico also had the highest rate of violence at 5%, but this is still 1/3 of the lowest non-state society. We often consider the 20th century to be the most violent period in history, but Pinker cites estimates that 40 million people died in battle during the century, but 6 billion people died overall. So the rate of battle deaths is around 0.7%, considerably lower than in any of the non-state societies. Even if we add in the deaths from genocides, purges, and other man-made disasters, we get the number of 180 million, which can be blamed on all these human causes put together, which still pushes the rate up to only 3%. If Pinker is right, that Hobbes is right in the secular debate, maybe the Calvinists do have the better of the theological argument. Maybe humans are inherently bad, and it's only the state that inhibits their bad tendencies. Where Jonathan Edwards saw God and Jesus as the only power between sinful humans and the pit of hell, Pinker and Hobbes see the Leviathan, the state. But our religious ancestors on the Unitarian side were Arminians. That is, they argued that humans were neither inherently good nor inherently bad. There was a Dutch theologian in the beginning of the 16th century named Jacobus Arminius, and that's who they followed. Humans are neither inherently good nor inherently bad, but how they end up depends on their life circumstances and the choices they make. Free will. You write your own ticket to heaven or hell. So Hobbes fits in comfortably with this Arminian outlook. Arminians, Unitarians, are comfortable with engineered virtue. Virtue brought about by manipulating social and educational factors to get the best result. Let me mention a couple of other scientific perspectives. Frank Copeland's wife, Barbara Whitaker Johns, who preached here a month ago, was co-chair of a conference sponsored by IRAS, the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science, in June of 2011, which considered scientific perspectives on evil. I was not able to attend, but fortunately some of the papers presented have now been published in IRAS's scholarly journal, which is called Zygon. Two are of particular interest. In one, a cognitive neuroscientist named William Shoemaker summarizes the scientific literature on human moral behavior in the brain. He walks us through the different regions of the brain with names such as the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex. These individual areas work together in what he calls the social brain network, which influences, if it doesn't actually determine, our relation to others. Now, the most interesting fact that I found there had to do with psychopaths. A psychopath is a person with little or no empathy who often gets involved in the criminal justice or mental health system. I think my own client, John Arnold, might very well have been a psychopath. Shoemaker cited studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which looks at blood flow in the brain regions, and a newer technique called voxel-based morphometry, or VBM, which looks at the amount of gray matter. What the studies found was that psychopaths have normal fMRIs, that is, they did not have brain lesions, but the VBM revealed that they had significantly less gray matter in the frontal and temporal brain regions than normal people. But Shoemaker warns that it's too simplistic to conclude that people are psychopaths because they have less brain tissue in key places, but that to me is a very interesting physical fact that I have not seen before about the psychopathic neuroanatomy. This discipline is just getting going, but it shows great promise. It locates the root of antisocial behavior, not in reasoning, not in moral codes, but in the limbic system, and the brain of the subject. Another very different scientific approach is represented by Irvin Staub, a professor emeritus of psychology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Staub himself, as a child in Budapest, escaped death in the Holocaust only through the intervention of a Swede named Raoul Wallenberg and a Hungarian woman named Maria, who worked for their family. He devoted his life to the study and prevention of genocide and mass killings. His article discusses the economic, cultural, and social conditions which he and his colleagues have found to be conducive to genocide in the Holocaust, in the Armenian-Turkish genocide of 1915, and in Rwanda in 1994. The work looks at the commonalities among these three disparate historical episodes. He finds genocide tends to happen when there's an us and them way of thinking, when there's an overly strong respect for authority, when there's a monolithic as opposed to pluralistic culture, and an autocratic political system. Staub does not just theorize about genocide, but he and his colleagues tackle active measures to prevent it. They go to places which have the indicated factors and try to work in the society to prevent those from sliding toward genocidal outcomes. So, evil, the task I've chosen, is a vast subject. We don't have time to explore it in any more detail this morning, but I will wrap up by offering several tentative conclusions. Here's your take-home. You can take notes now. First, if evil is anywhere, it is in here, in the heart, more than it is out there. Each of us has the capacity to do and say harmful things. Human beings are not pure metals, but alloys, all of us. Secondly, my universalist heritage gives me a faith that no one, including the worst actors among us, is totally given over to harmful ways. No one is beyond any possibility of redemption. That is why the death penalty will always seem immoral to me. Thirdly, organizations and systems beyond the individual, the nation, the community, the church, can have a great effect on creating or discouraging harmful acts. Civilization is generally a good thing, and how one is brought up can make a great difference. Fourth, there are some constants in morality, but a great deal of it evolves over time. When I was younger, the idea of same-sex marriage would have grossed me out, and I embraced recreational drugs as a liberating tool. Now I embrace marriage for my same-sex friends, and am conscious of the great harm wrought by drug and alcohol addiction in the families in this church and community. So there are few eternal absolutes in good and evil. Fifth, the word evil may not be helpful, but the fight against the things included in that term is what gives life meaning. And we as religious people are called to that struggle, not just against murder and violence, but against oppression, racism, homophobia, sexism, alienation, materialism, ignorance, hatred, poverty, and war. The trick, as Jesus taught, and as we need to keep teaching ourselves over and over, is not to do evil in the name of fighting it. Lastly, science can and should study human capacities for violence, for deception and self-deception, for empathy and its opposite, indifference, for cooperation, for compassion, and the findings of science should be adopted as policy by educators and society at large to mold future generations into more compassionate, more empathetic, less violent people. Using everything we know and supporting each other, discussing and debating and rolling up our sleeves and plunging in, we build the beloved community here on earth, one insight at a time.